Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where I am going to go over the making of the second community scenario. Like the last one, the characteristics for this battle were all chosen by the community via a series of polls on Discord, which generated a red attack in a town, with both sides scoring points by holding occupy objectives and destroying the other player's units. Obviously, in concept, this is going to be very different to the first scenario. That was a meeting engagement where both sides basically have the same objectives. With this being an attack scenario, the attacking and defending players have very different tasks, and that needs a different mission design approach. One way to tackle an attack-defense scenario is to pitch it as a tactical problem. We create a task for the player, then design the terrain, objectives and forces to make achieving that task challenging. For our purposes right now, this doesn't need to be very balanced. It should be fun and interesting to play, obviously, but because this is a tournament scenario intended to be played from both sides and the scores added up, it doesn't really matter that much. The second major difference is the change of terrain. This time, the scenario needs to take place in a town. Exactly what constitutes town terrain rather than city or village terrain isn't 100% clear. There's a lot of variety in the base game between different maps designated towns, so I've focused in on a mix of big chunky buildings and wide open spaces, terrain that is identifiably urban, but still has plenty of room for manoeuvre. I've started off aiming at an old industrial zone, big brick mills, rail yards, canals, maybe some terraced housing. Why would American and Soviet forces be fighting over this kind of area in a Cold War gone hot scenario though? Well, Soviet doctrine in general was to avoid getting bogged down fighting through urban areas. The idea was to keep up speed and momentum by bypassing towns and cities as much as possible. Not very helpful for our battle here, but there are two follow-on effects to that kind of doctrine. First, American forces could potentially end up trapped and isolated inside those urban areas. And second, the long ranges of modern weapons mean they could potentially still cause problems. So an interesting concept here could be a battered US force using the upper stories of some of the big mill buildings to fire tow missiles at Soviet forces bypassing the town and heading to the front. That's something that the Soviets would have to deal with, so they'd send a force in to seize the mills and destroy the Americans. For added flavour, all the high quality Soviet formations are probably miles away on the front lines, and it's poorer quality Category C units that are going to have to take on this mopping up job. If we have a Soviet force with T-55s and old BTRs up against a more modern but under-strength American force, we've got some nice asymmetry to play about with too. With that in mind, it's time to start blocking in the map. Map size is an important question here, but also a real two-edged sword. Obviously both players need room to manoeuvre and room to make decisions, but the bigger the map is, the more work needs to go into areas that players might not ever engage with, especially for urban areas that need more detail. In the end, I went for 1000 by 600 meters, and like you've been watching in the background, started blocking the map in by adding in a canal and some railway lines before moving on to the big old mill buildings. These are going to be where the ground objectives are, so I'm already thinking about Red's avenues of attack. I usually think in terms of going left, right and up the middle when I'm planning, and I'm going to lean into that here. The idea is to build the scenario up so that each approach has its advantages and disadvantages. Going up the centre is going to be the most direct approach, but because it follows the line of the canal and the railway yards, there are a lot more buildings to deal with. I'm intending on giving the red player a pretty armour-heavy force, in other words a force that isn't really appropriate for winkling the enemy out of an urban area, so although hey diddle diddle straight up the middle is the simplest option, it's going to come with some costs. Having buildings in between the objective mills on the left and Red's deployment zone on the right is also a good way of breaking up line of sight and making sure we don't get any of those annoying turn 1 shootouts. So I've also added in a big heap of raw materials, or a slag heap, or whatever this might be. Then we have a more modern industrial park behind it, before the map is broken north to south by another railway line on an embankment. This embankment is going to serve as the defining line for the Red deployment zone. They should be pretty safe behind that. The easiest way through is on the right. Here the elevated railway crosses the main line and the adjacent road, and that gives Red the option to avoid cresting the embankment. This leads directly towards the mills, but the rail yard is a very dangerous open killing field. That is naturally a two-way street. Blue defenders can dominate the ground, but they're liable to be outnumbered and outgunned by red attackers, so although it might look risky, red has a good chance to gain fire superiority from this flank. That said, I added in a section of terraced housing in the top left corner to give blue another defensive position with options for a bit of crossfire from defilade. This could really allow blue to sweep the rail yard with fire, but that same open space in the centre will make it very, very risky for any defenders there to relocate if red doesn't attack down that flank. The terraces themselves are the kind of housing that goes along with big mills like this. The Industrial Revolution might have massively increased productivity, but it was also very labour intensive. So the housing that went along with newer expanding industries was all about cramming as many people into as small a place as possible. That's what I've tried to replicate here. We've got rows of tightly packed houses in narrow streets. Of course, covering the entire map in dense housing would probably tilt us from town towards city, as well as having a significant performance impact. So I've restricted the terraces to that top left corner and red's deployment zone. The other feature on the right is a park. Again, this is very open and not really an obstacle, especially for the tanks, but it's slightly more interesting than wacky and more cabbage fields. The left is more complex. The big challenge for red is that they have to cross the canal twice if they choose this avenue of approach, so I've tried to make that doable and kept the left beyond the canal open so red can benefit from that fire superiority. I messed about with putting bridges in for the first crossing, but it was really fiddly and really too much of a choke point, so instead I decided to create a bit of a land bridge. The concept is that the side of one of the nearby buildings has collapsed into the canal, not only creating a rubble crossing point, but blocking it and drying out the canal bed downstream. I know that that really isn't how canals work, but it gives red a decent, if soggy, approach route. The mill buildings immediately opposite that crossing point might be a good defensive position for blue too, but they also serve to block line of sight from the much larger objective buildings in the centre, and offer blue the same dilemma about relocating that they have on the right. Beyond the canal side mills, I've added in another big rail yard. This again offers red huge fields of fire into the side of the objective buildings and, if covered, makes it very dangerous for blue forces to try and escape or relocate from elsewhere. I added in another railway line on an embankment to both fill out the bottom map edge and to give red a relatively safe area they can concentrate in. A means of getting across the canal again, from the rail yard to the mills, proved a bit tricky due to the way water and elevations interact with the different kinds of bridges. The best way to make it work turned out to be to put some engineered girder bridges in. These are very exposed, so red's really going to need fire superiority or a shed load of smoke to force a way across, but they do lead right up to the objective buildings. With the broad layout down, it's time to start thinking about forces and how they're going to interact with each other over this kind of terrain. For the Soviets, like I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to put some of the less used, poorer quality equipment in the spotlight. That means T-55s and BTR-60PAs. Conveniently, the Soviets are really up on their combined arms, so finding a BTR battalion task force that mixes these two units up isn't that difficult. A company of motor rifle infantry and a couple of square T-55 platoons should be enough to get the job done. It might sound like overkill, but I'm planning to restrict the ground objectives to the actual mill buildings themselves. That means that the tanks can't get in the objectives to control or contest them. Soviet infantry can, but the terrain around the mill buildings is probably not going to be a happy place for anyone on foot. There's really not a lot of cover. So we have a mission design element here that pretty much forces the Soviet player to use combined arms to win. Red will need to support their infantry with their tanks to succeed. I also added in a platoon of engineers here because they're always handy in urban terrain. There's going to be a lot of walls and buildings that the Soviet player might need to blast through depending on their chosen avenue of attack. The blue force, on the other hand, is somewhat trickier to build. Narratively speaking, it needs to be a bit battered and under strength with limited offensive capacity. This basically translates into limited vehicles. No tanks, maybe a few M113s or jeeps. I messed around with a few formations but ultimately settled on an infantry company. To pull some of its teeth, I made all the squads light, meaning they had no organic Dragon ATGMs or M60 machine guns, and set everything to 70% strength and adequate rather than full supply, as well as deleting the machine gun and FO teams. This essentially leaves a load of 7 to 8 man infantry squads armed with assault rifles. Absolutely the kind of force that can massacre Soviet infantry trying to cross the open ground outside the mills, but also a force that is borderline helpless against Soviet tanks that stay out of range of their M72 Laws. That's maybe a little bit too far. The blue player should be able to have as much fun as the red player, so I added a Dragon team to each platoon and reactivated one of the 2 M60s. That should give the US infantry a limited ability to fend off enemy armour at long range. A more significant AT capability comes from 2 TOW teams. These are much longer range and will absolutely mess up something like a T-55. In fact, these are the reasons the Soviets are stooping to mopping up the area in the first place. I went with 2 teams because one team becomes a hit and miss capability. I don't want Blue's success to ride on one unit that might decide to do something daft, but I don't think 2 is too much. Blue has some very restricted setup zones here, and there are really only 2 options for the TOWs: to put them on the flanks, in which case the central mills will block line of sight to the other flank and it will be dangerous to change position, or to stack them up in the objective buildings, which will be the focus of Soviet attention. Rounding out the blue force, I added in a couple of M113A2s. That way Blue has the option to ferry squads or small teams about, and a single dismounted 50 caliber machine gun. This should be pretty effective against BTRs, and I kinda like the idea that the Pixel Truckmen have looted it off a wrecked M113. Neither side here has any off-map support. It doesn't make that much sense for our little blue pocket, and I felt like giving the Soviets even more firepower would be overkill. They might miss having some smoke, granted, but given the thermal optics on the TOWs and Dragons, maybe not so much. A little bit of testing reveals 2 pretty critical elements. First, that I'd surrounded the mill area and rail yards with some high brick walls that were really a bit too much of a pain to deal with for Red. Specifically, I put one just on the other side of the rail embankment beyond Red's setup zone, so the Soviet player had to use some engineers to blow gaps. This slowed things down a lot and resulted in Red having to do quite a lot of traffic control micromanagement just to get out of their deployment zone. That's always a pain. In this case, it wasn't particularly difficult, and it was pretty easy to pick a spot to breach that Blue couldn't cover with fire, but in gameplay terms, it really translated into the red player spending the first 5 or 10 minutes of a 30-minute scenario fighting the game rather than fighting their opponent. It also created a basically mandatory use case for the engineers. While it's true that this is exactly what they're there for, this isn't some kind of tutorial where I want players to specifically blow a hole in this particular wall so they learn how to use the blast command. I want the players to see their engineer support as an asset that expands their options, not as the key that unlocks their deployment zone. So I've scrapped almost all the high walls, replacing them with wire fences. These have the added benefit of allowing BTRs to punch through them, as well as the tanks, but the disadvantage of opening up more sight lines for Blue. And that's fine in this situation. The removal of the walls doesn't compromise any deployment zone protection or anything like that. The second issue was the effectiveness of Blue's ATGMs. I lost 4 T-55s on top of the railway embankment to only 2 Dragon teams, which isn't the kind of loss ratio I'm really looking for here. T-55s are pretty blind, so the likelihood of concealed small teams getting the first shot is even higher than usual, but with 3 Dragon teams and 2 TOW teams, Blue had about 18 to 19 missiles to throw about. Sure, not all of these might hit, but they've got a really good chance, and I don't want Blue to have that kind of advantage. So I dropped all the ATGM teams down to a limited ammo state, and actually went so far as deleting one of the infantry platoons. That gives Blue 8 to 10 ATGMs in total, while Red is bringing 9 T-55s and a boatload of BTRs to the party. I think that's a much closer margin, and with fewer ATGM teams to go around, Blue's decisions about where they deploy and when they open fire are going to be really important. Thinking about the objectives, we'll need some ground objectives and unit objectives like last time, but because of the difference between meeting engagements and attacks, I needed to mess with the weighting. This is much more terrain focused, so occupy objectives are going to need more points. Exactly how to lay out those ground objectives is, however, a really good question. The mills, in particular the tallest mill, are the places that Blue has been using to sight their TOWs that interdict passing Red units in the narrative, and I'm very much designing the map around them. But these are big, chunky buildings, and because of combat missions' objective mechanics, even a single enemy soldier inside can contest them. So if I was to make one of these entire mills an objective, The Soviet player would have to clear every single chunk of the building, floor by floor, to make sure that blue hasn't hidden a lone pixel trapping in a corner somewhere. Conversely, because the extent of ground objectives is delineated by an area on the map's surface and this is blocked by the footprint of buildings, just marking out a specific section or wing of a building isn't clear enough to the players. Neither is a common fallback method, which is making hollow objectives. To get around this, I've had to engage in some urban remodelling. I've cut off the tall side of the biggest mill, left the space, and then added some extra stories. Now we've got a very obvious objective building that is small and contained enough to not pose too much of a problem for red to clear. Being massive is a problem, as that building now gives blue an incredible view around the map that fairly compromises red's deployment zone safety. To get around that, I've simply left it out of blue's deployment zone. Blue can get something like a tow team up to the 10th floor if they really want to, but because they can't start there and they'll have to climb the stairs and then deploy, it's going to take a lot of time. And that's time during which blue may will rather those tows were already set up and engaging T-55. So again, we've got a decision point. The mill tower objective is red's main effort. They need to take it to deny it to the Americans, so it's worth 500 points for them, but it's only worth 300 points for blue. Blue is basically having a last stand here, so their points are weighted away from terrain and towards causing more damage. Red has some points on the table for knocking out blue's ATGMs, but rather than adding in more occupy objectives that would channel red in specific directions and take away some player agency, I filled out the remaining points with a couple of phase line touch objectives. These are there to reward red players for advancing up the map. Even if they can't take the mill tower, or they don't think they can still stay in the game by moving forward. In the bigger picture, that would put the Soviets in a better position for future assaults. So, that is a quick run through of the making of the second community scenario. Like with the first one, I'm probably going to keep tweaking away and refining things right up until the last moment, and I really hope you all have a good time with it when it goes live. Lots of options here, lots of decision points for both sides, and an opportunity for the T-55s and BTR-60PAs to get a look at the action, even if it's probably going to end really badly for them. Hope you all enjoyed this video. I'll catch you in the next one.